global maritime trade in how we maybe some of the opportunity because of the disruptions.
Okay, I think everyone is in, so maybe we can just get started so that you'll get started early and we have more time for Q&A and sharing. So thank you everyone for coming by for today's brown bag. Today's brown bag is by Estelle. Many of you know her, or you've also read her profile. And today's brown bag topic is really on employee motivation and work engagement. And what's interesting is she's looking at what are the major trends in the non-Western scholarship that is an increasingly important part of us thinking about what it means to help companies, organizations, and policymakers in this part of the world. Right, I will not read the synopsis, you've read that. And I will also not do a full introduction of Estelle, except that she's been a very capable and dedicated member of our research team since she joined us last year. So I think we're in for a very good session, and she has lots of insights and she's got a lot of intelligent things to share with you. Right, so over to you, Estelle.
Thank you, King Wang, and good afternoon, everybody. And let me just share my screen first. Okay, so everybody hopefully can see my slides. Right, so as King Wang introduced me just now, my name is Estelle Musagulova, and I'm a research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities. I am working with the Open Loop Careers project. Just briefly about myself, I got my PhD from Nanyang Technological University last year. I specialized in public policy and global affairs, but I generally look at public management issues in public policy. And my area of specialization is organizational behavior and human resource management, narrowly in the public sector, but recently, especially when I'm working with the Open Loop Careers team, I've also started venturing into the general workforce management, so all sectors, not just the public sector. Just a bit of my background, I'm actually, I'm originally from Kazakhstan. And in Kazakhstan, I used to work as a civil servant for about 5 odd years. And I worked for this agency, which is called Agency for Civil Service Affairs, which is a government agency responsible for policy of human resource management for the entire government. So for the entire public sector, that includes civil servants narrowly, not the entire public sector, which is what makes my interest in public sector human resource management probably more understandable, because I worked in this area and I do have the practical experience. So now I sort of go into more of the academic theoretical side of things, and I try to sort of bring my practical experience into the research that I'm doing. So this is my background. So today I'm going to be talking about employee motivation and work engagement. So the outline of today's presentation is as follows. First of all, I'm going to discuss why are motivation and engagement important? Why do we need to study them? Then I will cover some of the theories of motivation, and specifically the theory that I use mostly in my research. There's only one theory of work engagement that is more or less widespread and relied upon in the research, academic research. So that's the theory I'm going to be talking about today. So it's theory, not theories plural. And I'll also do a brief overview of recent studies, and that is going to be probably shameless self-promotion, because some of these, or most of these studies are actually by me. I will talk about the theoretical foundations of the field broadly, but I'd like to sort of highlight the kind of work I have done personally in this. And I will end on the note of, so what? You know, the usual question we probably need to constantly keep asking ourselves as academics: what are the implications for practice? So what does my research actually mean? Okay, so why are motivation and engagement actually important to study? And so I kind of used the sociological perspective on work here. So the definition broadly is task or efforts that a person undertakes with the goal of being productive in a way that meets human needs. And you can see that I highlighted tasks, efforts, and being productive. So I emphasize them on purpose because I feel like these words probably need to be further elaborated. what is behind these human tasks or efforts, and what is behind being productive? How do we achieve that? So you probably can tell from your own experience, you don't just get up in the morning and go off to work. Something drives you, right? And in my research, what I try to understand is what it is that drives us. What is the mechanism that drives us to go to work every day and do our jobs? How does it manifest itself, practically speaking? Using the terms that the terms and instances we're all familiar with. And more importantly, I'm interested in how to achieve motivation and work engagement, and all these other factors that make people productive at work, make them perform. So this is briefly what I'm interested in and why I want to study motivation and engagement in my work, and why I feel it's important to study in my day-to-day research. So if we take a less granular perspective and we sort of think about the larger scheme of things, why are motivation and engagement important? I mean, it is understandable that every manager, business owner, and head of the organization wants the employees to be motivated to perform well. But on a grander scale, if we think about the changes happening globally right now, so things like automation of some tasks and jobs, some of them are disappearing, and individuals have to increasingly take on increasingly different jobs and tasks because their jobs are being automated. Remote work means there are fewer interactions, and hence there are fewer ways for managers to actually motivate their employees. There's also competition from abroad because of an increasingly more open global market and longer life expectancy. So we also need to see, what it is we can do to retain top workers, to motivate them well. And open loop careers, which is the project I'm working on at LKYCAC, it basically essentially means that careers are becoming more fractured and non-linear, and people are changing a multitude of different jobs and career pathways over their lifetime. And that means that they may not necessarily work in a job long enough to sort of be motivated 100%. So how do we deal with these workers? How do we motivate them? How do we manage them? That's also why motivation and engagement are important to study. So when it comes to motivation, there are many theories. It's one of the most well-developed areas in psychology. And there are two types of theories. So there's content and there's process theories. So content theories usually focus on what it is that people need in their lives, what factors, events, or manifestations of different factors that motivate them, that they need to be motivated. Whereas process theories are more concerned with behavioral processes that actually affect motivation. So you can see that, for example, Maslow's needs theory, probably everyone has heard of it. It's probably one of the most well-known theories of motivation, but it's increasingly less used in the research. So some of the other theories include Herzberg's hygiene theory, two-factor theory. There's McClelland's theory of needs, which is a theory of needs such as achievement, affiliation, and power. In my research, you can see it highlighted in red. I mostly rely on self-determination theory. So self-determination theory is by Deci and Ryan, and I will talk about this more in detail on the next slide. Self-determination theory is a theory of motivation that states that for motivated, self-determined behavior, individuals need three needs fulfilled, satisfied. The need for autonomy, so the need to have volition, to be self-determined, and to have the free will to choose whatever actions the individual wants to pursue. The need for competence, so the need to be proficient and professional and well-skilled in something, in a given task or a job or an action. And the need for relatedness, so when an individual does something, they need to feel connectedness to other people or social network or a sense of belonging. So according to self-determination theory, these are three needs that actually need to be fulfilled in order for an individual to be intrinsically motivated. And I am going to talk now about intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. So I think Most people, probably in this talk, most of the listeners right now would have heard of this extrinsic-intrinsic dichotomy. So intrinsically motivated is when your motivation comes from within yourself and you're just taking pure enjoyment of the task, in the task. But extrinsic motivation is when your motivation is brought on by external factors. So you're motivated by something else, not within you, but rather without you. So some of the more common examples include I'm intrinsically motivated because I enjoy the task, and I'm extrinsically motivated when I'm being paid for the job I do. So that's extrinsic motivation, payment, for example. So the interesting thing is that extrinsic intrinsic is always here. But the novel approach that self-determination theory offers is that actually motivation is a continuum. It's not a dichotomy. So it's not just extrinsic, intrinsic, it's a continuum of different motivations. And even then, some of these motivations may even coexist. So they can, one person can have several types of different motivations at once. So to make this diagram a bit clearer to you, to sort of explain to you, you can see that these are the different types of motivation that exist according to Deci and Ryan. So a motivation is when any motivation just is absent. So you can't really do anything to make an individual motivated. You can't pay them and they're not intrinsically motivated. So they won't even embark upon this task because they're amotivated. But extrinsic motivation, as you can see here, actually is a range. So there's external, introjected, identified, and integrated. And then there's intrinsic motivation, which at the sort of heart of it has this intrinsic self-regulation. So you can also see in smaller fonts here that a motivation it's also a scale. It's non-self-determined, and so is extrinsic motivation to a certain extent, whereas intrinsic motivation is self-determined. Another term for this, which is probably more familiar, might be more familiar to the audience, is autonomous. So self-determined basically means autonomous, non-self-determined means controlled or non-autonomous. So intrinsic motivation is completely autonomous because it's within my control, right? Intrinsic, I'm getting my motivation from within. My motivation is autonomous. It's not dependent on anything else. If my motivation is controlled by things like money, a prospect of being promoted, then it is already controlled by external factors. So it's non-self-determined. So you can see here that there are also some words like internalized and not internalized. I will talk about this a bit later, but sort of explain to you what these mean, a range of extrinsic motivations. I will try and use an example that might maybe resonate with some people to explain how external motivation is different from introjected, from identified and integrated. A word of caution on identified and integrated. They are increasingly being used as the same type because it's really difficult empirically to distinguish between the two. So in a lot of research, you'd see just the identified or just the integrated motivation. And I'll try and explain how. So an example that I might use is a behavior such as, for example, working with data. So it's one of the tasks in some of our jobs, working with data. So I'm intrinsically motivated to work with data if it brings me enjoyment. So that's an example of intrinsic motivation. I love working with data. If data speaks to me, I love it. I enjoy it. This is intrinsic motivation. Identified motivation is when I don't necessarily love the task, but I don't hate it. And I also understand that it is really important for me. So I identify with the values of that action. So being able with the data, for example, is important for my career growth. And it's important for my future. So I identify with its value to my life. So that's how and the value must be sort of obscure. It's not a concrete thing like pay, which is something I'm going to cover later. So I identify with the value that's identified, and integrated motivation as well. Like I said, it's difficult to distinguish between the two because integrated basically means that my values are integrated with this particular behavior, even though I don't love it. So that's what integrated means. Introjected is this non-autonomous motivation when I'm not exactly motivated by some external forces, but these forces are not tangible exactly. So for example, if my colleagues are good at working with data and I'm not, I will feel embarrassed. Now, a feeling of embarrassment is not an external force, it's internal, but it's still something that I don't identify with. So this makes it an introjected type of motivation. So my professor, whom I've learned this theory with and from, he really likes using this example of this behavior on the MRT train, for example. If you sit in the reserved seat and then an elderly person walks in, or a pregnant woman comes in, or someone with a small child, if you don't get up, nobody's going to come up to you and fine you, or I don't know, physically punish you, but they will probably judge you. So if you get up because you are scared that they will judge you, that's introjected motivation, because judgment is not a physical punishment. It's internal within. Everybody's judging secretly, but you are still motivated to get up because you don't want to be judged, and that's introjected motivation. So that could be maybe a good example. And external motivation is when the prospect of a punishment or a reward is very, very tangible. So for example, if I'm not able to work with data, my boss will demote me or fire me or something like that. So that's external motivation. So hopefully now we all understand a bit more what motivation is in self-determination theory. And I will talk about what can we actually do with controlled motivation. And controlled motivation, if we remember, is not internalized and not self-determined. It's external motivation, introjected motivation, and obviously a motivation, but that we can't really do much with. So how it can be reduced is actually it can be internalized. So you can see that introjected and external types of extrinsic motivation are not internalized. And that means that the value of the action has not been internalized by the individual. And that's why they're not experiencing intrinsic or at least identified or integrated motivation, which are internalized. So according to Deci and Ryan's self-determination theory, in order to internalize the action, people must perceive enough autonomy, competence, and relatedness when they are doing the task. And these three factors are called the most important psychological needs for that reason, because they actually lead to intrinsically motivated behavior, right? So I'll give you some of the sort of practical examples of what that means in the context of work. So if we know that an employee is not intrinsically motivated, how can we understand why and what to do with it? So the why of it, there are different ways to deal with finding out the levels of motivation of employees. Some surveys, some conversations, regular meetings with the manager. Obviously, there needs to be some sort of goodwill in order for the employee to share their problems with motivation. There are also ways to observe employees and to sort of make a conclusion what it is that's not working for them in this particular job. But when we talk about the actual practical aspects of this, we need to understand whether they're lacking autonomy, whether they're lacking competence or relatedness, or all three, or two, or of the three, or whatever combination of the three. So for autonomy, if we want to increase their autonomy, we need to be able to delegate more tasks, give much clearer instructions, but there still needs to be room for innovation and improvement, and there should be encouragement of suggestions. There's plenty of research that tests how these particular actions actually contribute to employee autonomy. For competence, there's always a need for feedback, discussing the progress that the employee makes, providing regular training opportunities so that the employee feels that they're actually increasing their competence. And interestingly enough, and I'll try and maybe talk about this, hopefully if I have time, recognition through adequate pay and promotion. So in this particular case, pay is not seen as an intrinsic motive. It's seen as a recognition of the basic need of the competence or of my value as a worker. And that's why pay would actually enhance intrinsic motivation rather than undermine it, because extrinsic motives usually do undermine intrinsic motivation. And for relatedness, it's things that we probably all know. So it's things like promoting team spirit, measuring things like personal organization fit. So do my values fit with the organization's values, different work groups based on skills and interests and things like that. I just recently joined a book club at SUTD, which is like one good example of promoting relatedness at work. So it's that kind of thing. Okay, so we've covered self-determination theory, and hopefully if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer some more later. And I would like to move on to public service motivation, which is very specific, but it's also part of my research. So I'd like to share a little bit about this. So public service motivation is a theory of motivation that says that some people have a predisposition to actually work in the kind of jobs that create public value. So these are usually public service, public sector jobs, civil servants, teachers, police workers, doctors, fire services, and so forth. So this is this theory that was developed in the late 80s in the US that says that public servants or people working for the public sector have a specific set of values that make them more motivated to work for the public service. And it's actually one of the key areas of study. If you Google public service motivation, you'd find thousands and thousands of articles. It's so prominent in public administration that it evolved separately from first other theories of motivation and second from other disciplines. There's no such concept in psychology, but there's a concept like that in public administration and policy, which is what I'm concerned with. So main areas explored are usually things like what factors lead to public service motivation, things like individual factors, personality traits, organizational factors, leadership, institutional factors like the entire government structures, things like outcomes. What does public service motivation lead to? Performance, job satisfaction, better person, job fit. And there's a multitude of moderators and mediators as well. And I'll try and maybe discuss this as part of discussing my research. Yay. So I know that in the title, I also promised to talk about the non-Western scholarship, and I will. And I think one of the key takeaways here from today would be that, unfortunately, non-Western scholarship in studies of motivation is far and few between, right? And the main sort of argument why we should study non-Western settings and motivation in non-Western context is because context does matter. And, you know, we can take Hofstede's theory of cultural dimensions that sort of posits that different countries and different cultural contexts have their own sets of values, which would affect everything pretty much. So when we look at the non-Western scholarship, we are also operating on a set of assumptions that evolved because these theories come primarily from the West. And by the West, I mean North America, and I mean Western Europe, and maybe a bit of Australia and New Zealand. So whenever they were developed, these theories, they were basing themselves primarily on the public and private sector values of the West, not other countries like Asia, for example. So I'll give you an example using public service motivation. It's commonly considered to be the only motive in the public sector in the West. So you work for the public service because you just love creating value for the public. You know, intrinsic motives are good and everything else is bad, okay? But none of this factors in cultural differences. So if we talk about cultural differences, for example, there are other motives in non-Western contexts which are not bad. They're just there because it's how the culture is. So for example, iron rice bowl in China. So a lot of people join public service for job security, and it works in China. There's also such concept of as filial piety in most Asian countries, and that's why some people join public service in some Asian countries, or most of them even. Things like status and image in some South Asian nations, it's incredibly difficult to get into the public service in countries like India, Pakistan, also China, South Korea. So in Central Asia, where I'm from, a lot of people join public service for networking purposes because they create a network that they may rely upon years and years later, even after they leave. So the question is, can they actually coexist with public service motivation, or do they have an adverse effect on public service motivation? All of these types of motivations, because as I mentioned before, it's commonly assumed that extrinsic motivation is bad and intrinsic motivation is good. And so if there are extrinsic factors, they usually undermine intrinsic motivation, making it controlled, making it non-internalized. So some of the examples of the research that I've personally done with my supervisors and my other academic colleagues is actually that context does matter. So one example is, for example, administrative tradition, so the larger makeup of the government and the tradition of governing the people, it does influence motivation as well. So for example, in more religious societies where there's also an elite tradition of public service, motivation is less likely to be extrinsic. It's more likely to be intrinsic. And in this particular paper, we compared Pakistan, which has, obviously it's an Islamic state, and it has a very elite tradition of public service that they inherited from the British. They have more intrinsic setup of motivation than in Kazakhstan, where motivation is quite extrinsic. Like I said, people join civil service for networking purposes and so forth. One other thing we studied is pursuit of extrinsic motives, such as high salary, is often seen as bad for intrinsic motivation. But we also found, using empirical data, that some extrinsic motives, which are about needs more than wants, actually can have a positive enhancing effect on motivation. So for example, like I said, the iron rice bowl, the job security, or non-monetary awards like best employee of the year, it's an extrinsic reward, but it can enhance my intrinsic motivation because I see it as a recognition of my needs and my value as an employee. So not all extrinsic motives are bad, another finding. Some other interesting findings from the research we've done. So in Taiwan, what we did is we tested an impact of, so basically the government in Taiwan significantly reduced the pension promise for the civil servants, and that constitutes a psychological contract breach. So I had the psychological contract with the government as an employee that it will pay me a high pension, but it didn't. So what we tried to test is, does that lead to regret about being in this job? And we found that those people who have a higher level of public service motivation actually experience stronger regret because they feel betrayed by the government. So motivation can actually also lead to these consequences as well. So we thought that was interesting. We also did comparisons of students of public service, of public administration and policy programs in Singapore versus those in the Netherlands. And we saw that in Singapore, future civil servants actually hopefully display more intrinsic motivation and public service motivation, but they also prefer more money. So we're not sure whether it's because in Singapore high salaries are really high for civil servants. That could be one. And what we also did is we did a big review of non-Western scholarship of public service motivation. And we basically saw that what's happening is there are some studies that use different contexts other than North America and Western Europe, but they just use them as a source of data rather than to illustrate cultural differences. So there's definitely much room for improvement. I am aware of time, just want to sort of leave some time for Q&A as well. So I'll talk about work engagement and sort of try and wrap up. So work engagement is this concept which is closely related to motivation, and it's basically a positive state of mind, effective motivational state of mind, which combines high energy with high levels of dedication and focus on work. And it's a relatively new concept developed by some Dutch scientists who mostly study human resource management. So the theoretical approach to work engagement, it's basically said to consist of three aspects: vigor, absorption, and dedication. So the vitality to do the work, the energy, the concentration on the task, and the enthusiasm about the organization, the work, the mission, and so forth. So these are the three aspects of work engagement. And this is also a scale. So if you see a scale measuring work engagement, it will have these three components to it. So to sort of understand how the whole thing fits in the context of work. So Bakker and Demeruti and Schaufelli and Bakker from the Netherlands, these people who came up with the model, they came with the work engagement model. They also came up with the job demands and resources model of work engagement. So what they're saying is that all of us at work, we have job resources as well as personal resources, and we have job demands. So job demands are those difficult, challenging things that happen to us at work, such as overload, conflicts at work, lack of security, and they lead to burnout. And burnout leads to obviously negative outcomes, from stress to bad health to turnover. We also have job resources. So things like support from our colleagues, feedback from our good feedback or constructive feedback from our seniors, training, coaching, job control, and flexible working times. And we have personal resources, which are not here. So things like self-efficacy. Some also say that motivation is a personal resource, but there's a big debate about whether it is or not. And those job resources, if present, they will lead to engagement, leading to positive outcomes such as individual and team performance, as well as innovation and creativity. Job resources, if used well, can also prevent burnout. You can see this arrow here. So not only it enhances engagement, it prevents burnout and hopefully prevents negative outcomes from happening as well. So that's the job demands resources model. Some of the recent research started to also look at other factors beyond resources and demands that can enhance work engagement. So things like job redesign and job crafting, when you sort of go into your particular job and you start crafting your work, your tasks, or changing them in a way that makes you more motivated or makes you more interested in your work. So that's an emerging concept. Leadership, so transformational leadership can also lead to work engagement when your leader is actually really clear about the tasks, leads by example, gives you good feedback, implements innovative solutions that sort of enhance motivation. That's transformational leadership. And strategic alignment is quite new. So strategic alignment is basically about communicating to the employees the strategy of the organization and employing human resource practices in a way that they're more aligned with the overall strategy of the company. This is more private sector stuff that has emerged very recently. So there's not a lot of research on it. So one example of the research I've done with job demands resources theory and work engagement is what I did is I combined the use of public service motivation theory with job demands and resources. And what I found is that I used PSM as a moderator. So I found that motivation, public service motivation, can actually strengthen the positive impact of job resources and work engagement. And it can also make the negative effect of some job demands more pronounced. So basically, if you have a higher PSM and higher motivation for public service, the effect of your perceived social impact on your work engagement is more pronounced. But if you have low public service motivation, then the effect of red tape in your work on your work engagement, the negative effect will also be more pronounced. So it's kind of similar to our research in Taiwan as well, where we saw that PSM can lead to some undesirable effects as well. So this research sort of also highlights that motivation is important for work engagement. Right now, it's still not entirely clear how these two concepts interact. So some of the practical implications of this: know what job demands exist in your organization. So what is it? Is it overwork, too much work, unclear tasks? Is there conflict happening maybe between teams or between individuals? Is there actually enough job security? Are there procedures in place to protect employees from unlawful dismissals and so forth, which is probably less relevant in Singapore, but it can still happen. So, if you know what your job demands are in your job, then you can decrease them by increasing job resources. So providing social support, providing good feedback, creating a better working environment in many ways, like giving resources, like actual resources like information to your employees. Also going back to the 3 needs that could also act as a job resource. And talking to your employees, interviewing them, having one-on-one conversations regularly to sort of keep the hand on the pulse. And I am just going to finish off with, what does this all mean for the kind of research I am doing at LKY-CIC? So as I mentioned earlier, we are studying open loop careers, which is a concept that reflects that the careers are becoming more non-linear. So instead of one life, one job, or one life, 2, 3 jobs max, and you spend a number of years in each job and you build up your skill, your resume, your network in that one job, careers are becoming more fragmented. So people have the volition to actually do whatever they want with their career without following the traditional pathway. And we sort of see that open loop careers is that particular phenomenon. So in this respect, we also need to understand when these open loop careers actually take place, how do individuals stay motivated when they transition so often? How do they retain their engagement? And what can employers do to motivate and engage in this increasingly non-linear nature of careers? So what we did is we included the motivation scale or intrinsic motivation, all the other types you've seen today, into the survey instrument for Open Loop Careers project. It's already in there. And we have some preliminary results from the pilot survey we just finished, 200 odd observations. We'll also assess work engagement in qualitative interviews to understand for people who do change careers often, how do they stay engaged? What's their experience? And hopefully we can use these results to understand how to enhance motivation and engagement as careers become much less linear and employers are changed frequently. We also try and see whether we can include more subjective indicators of career success in addition to objective ones. So for example, motivation is one subjective indicator of career success. If I'm motivated, you can consider my career successful, subjectively speaking, rather than objectively salary or promotions. So that's one other way in which motivation research can contribute to OLCs at LKYCIC. And that's it from me. I hope this was interesting and I'm happy to answer whatever questions you may have. And thank you so much for listening and coming today to the Brown Bag seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Estelle. I do have questions, but I talk to you quite regularly, so I shouldn't take up the airtime unless there is a need to later. Let me just open up the questions to the floor first, and let us take some questions from those who've made the time to join us today. Any questions from anyone? Just shout out in case I can't see your raised hand or your signal. Anyone? Right. As usual, as usual, these things take warming up. Maybe let me just jump in one question. I'm curious about the public sector motivation and how it's not so extrinsic, right, in some cultures. I was curious to know if you've looked at in any way or come across any studies that look at the structure of the economy. That means the type of industries, their pay levels, or the range and diversity of them, and the stage of economic development, and whether that changes the public sector motivation in any way. Because over the years, people's motivations to join the public sector, at least in Singapore and in some other countries, has waxed and waned according to whether there are more opportunities outside or inside. So I was just curious to see if you've done any work on that, or whether some of the work you've done has some bearing on this question that I just asked.
Can I just add to Kim Wang's question? Estelle, very interesting presentation. I suppose I've never analyzed it. I spent 4 decades in public service trying to motivate people, including myself, but I've never analyzed it from a more research academic point of view. So to add to Kim Wang's question, I thought that's a really good question. At the end of the day, then the issues of money, right? And Singapore, to a certain extent, well, not just money, but what interests people when they do the work. So Singapore's government's policies has always tried to ensure they pay decent market salaries in the public service, right? And of course, okay, there's another level of a conversation which we probably don't want to go there. There's huge arguments over politicians' salaries. They're not public servants, but politicians here are paid well, right? But probably not as well as if you compare to the major CEOs of large companies, right? But still fairly handsome pay, and there's always debated in Parliament. But for the public servants, it is, maybe just to give everybody a background, the Public Service Division actually does a lot of pegging of the salaries. They do study where are the salaries for different types of professions, whether it's engineers, IT, which is now, of course, very high salaries, and then they pack to what is a reasonable salary. And a public service in Singapore has very, very complicated and sophisticated ways of looking at promotion, etc. But it's not just about money, but it's also about the culture of the public service. I personally always feel that people join public service, you must have a certain ethos in you, that you want to serve, because it's not just about money, the job means something to you, right? So there's a certain self-motivation inside out, which is very important. It's not just about money. Okay, sorry, to cut the long story short, to add to King Wan's question, really it's about money and interest. Have you done studies whereby there is a calibration? Because there are many, many things that affects motivation. Is there a study that has actually calibrated how much of it is money, how much of it is culture, how much it is satisfying personal interest, etc.? If you can, then wow, that's a very good formula. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chong, and thanks, King Wang, for your question. Actually, when I was working for the government in Kazakhstan, we had this new boss, and he came in and he was really interested in using data, and that's of the Agency of Civil Service Affairs, because we collected all the data of all the civil servants. And his hypothesis was that, because we were analyzing this metric, which was how many people per vacancy apply. So the application rate per vacancy. And the higher it was, the more we kind of argued that it's prestigious to work for the public service. It's a good thing. And then he said, look, guys, the more people apply for the public service jobs, it means that there are fewer jobs probably in the private sector that year. So if you analyze it, maybe in years when there's a bit of an economic crisis and the jobs in the private sector shrink, it's more likely that there will be more demand for public sector jobs. First, because of security, second, because those jobs are available as opposed to the private sector. So I thought that was super interesting and worth looking into. I have not done any studies myself, but I'm aware of a recent study that actually does look at the dynamic of public sector employment in times of economic crisis. And I think that study did find that demand does increase in the times where there's probably a bit of a hardship going on and jobs in the private sector are less available. So people usually would go for public sector jobs, turn to public sector jobs for employment. Of course, the question is, are those people motivated by the desire to serve the public, or they just want employment, right? So there are some studies that look at the larger economic factors of public sector employment. And I can maybe share some of these studies with you.
Sal, and along the same spirit, there is a question from Jamie Bloomfield in the chat, which is related. So I thought I'd bring it up since it's related. This is the last question in the chat group. This may not have come up in your data collection, Jamie asks, but have you noticed any differences in motivations from public servants who describe themselves as working for the public service versus those who describe themselves as working for the government, even though they are also public servants?
I think this is an excellent question, actually, and this would be a really interesting study because it would use this instrument of framing, right? So does the framing of the job actually make a difference, working for the government versus working for the public? And I have not come across any studies that do that. There's actually an increase in using these framing devices to tease out some of the results, so the quasi-experimental sort of design of studies recently. So I think this would be a really interesting thing to see, because yes, in some countries, people would perceive themselves working for the government rather than serving the public. So, there's a subtle difference there. So I think that's a great question, and maybe definitely worth looking into.
Maybe just to add to that on a cultural difference, an interesting point is, you were comparing Western and non-Western. I have met people who work for countries that have monarchs who own everything, like Brunei or the Middle East. They are interesting studies, because some people feel that if you don't work for the king, it's not a real job, because everything is owned by the king, particularly in Brunei. You know what I mean? Yeah. So the civil service jobs are highly sought after because it seemed to be stable, it's paid well, So the perception is indeed there because the market economy is less active, right? Compared to what is owned by kings, who own everything. I think Middle East used to be like that. I don't know about now, because many of the public service jobs, when you have a huge royal family, you find that everybody is from the royal family in the civil service, in the public service. But I'm not even sure they call it public service because they work for the king, you see. Yeah. So that also is a very interesting, very different type of culture we're talking about.
Yes, exactly. So, and that is the key distinction between sort of, if we have to roughly say the East and the West, because in the countries like North America and Western Europe, public sector jobs, or public service jobs rather, are not that well paid. They're not pegged to private sector salaries. So of course, if I want money, I will go to the private sector. So yeah, it's probably more likely that people who work for the public service are motivated by working for the public or creating some sort of value for the public. But in other countries, especially in countries where either the public sector is so huge, like the Middle Eastern countries, or even the countries of the former Soviet Union, the public sector is massive. And that's where the majority of jobs are. And the people just want to work in those jobs. Or for example, the status and the prestige factor in Asian countries and South Asian nations, like I mentioned, India, Pakistan, it's really difficult to get into the civil service. In China and South Korea, huge competition. So these theories don't take that into consideration. So back to your question, Dr. Cheong, about whether some studies have actually tried to look at everything. So most studies, when they look at motivation, they do have a range of questions that ask, why did you join the public service? And they would have responses. And obviously people would rate different reasons differently. So you would see that, yes, usually there's a number of reasons why people decide to work for the public service, to serve the public, to learn something new, to earn the salary and so forth. So we can see that sort of picture. So I think the interesting thing would be to understand whether the difference in those motivations affect performance in some way. Because if I'm working for the entity whose main value is to serve the public, would that affect my performance if I join because I want a higher salary? So we kind of want to see whether the mismatch in motivations according to the value of organizations we work for affect our performance or job satisfaction or work engagement, because they are also important. So yes, those studies do exist. So kind of what we do with them is another question. What do we do with the results?
Sorry to add to more questions. Another interesting area is to consider age. Whether the young people nowadays are motivated differently from, say, people who are already middle age or older, right? That's another interesting area. Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that probably would take a few years to understand. But yeah, I agree. I think it's a good, it's a good sort of new area to go into. I think there are a few studies in private sector human resource management that looks at millennials' motivation, and maybe Zoomers will also be covered soon. See, whether they differ in their motivation from other. So, for example, millennials tend to prefer more feedback, tend to prefer to understand how their work contributes to the organization more than their counterparts from older generations. So those are some of the findings. Yeah. Sorry, are there more questions?
Yes, there are. So there are two more questions in the chat group. One from Jamie and one from Alexander. But I thought in interest of time, since Yiming has his hand up, we should get all the questions out on the table because they may be related and we can take them on all at the same time. Yeah. So maybe Yiming, if you can ask your question, and then we'll see whether we can group the questions up for Acel to respond.
Yep, hi, I'm Yiming. I'm from the MUSPP program. Yeah, and thank you for the overview of work theories. I found it very interesting. I guess my question will actually be related, in fact, to like Jamie's question, right? His first question on the Asian context, which you mentioned as something to localize this kind of research in the local context. So actually, I'm more of an idea in the Singapore context. I was wondering if this factor would be important for these studies. And so the factor I'm thinking about is Singapore's national drive for upskilling, reskilling, where there's a greater institutional emphasis or focus on cultivating applied skills based on whatever is upcoming societal or economic trends like the fourth industrial revolution. And I was wondering if this itself constitutes a form of extrinsic motivation, right? where like students, even in universities, are nudged towards like all these jobs or skills which the government has identified as important. And would this could perhaps like be at the expense of like less utilitarian, less instrumental, and more intrinsic motivations, sort of like a cause-based motivations, like you want to fight for climate change, or perhaps even like learning for the sake of like fundamental knowledge, whether in the social sciences or humanities, which is also very important for like societal innovation. So I think my question would be whether this like instrumental national upskilling drive is itself important factor for like people's motivations in their careers.
So Sal, maybe there are three questions in that big question. One is what Yiming asked. Two is what Jamie asked about Eastern mindsets. And then there is something from Alexander, which I think is related, which is the first point there about generational culture shifts, which you alluded to about Zoomers and millennials and so on. So maybe more broadly, what are some of these different factors that could affect motivation? And so any thoughts you might have on these different specific dimensions?
Okay, I think I'm going to try and address Yiming's question, and then I'll go on to Alexander's and Jamie's questions as well. Actually, that's a really interesting question, Yiming. I do think that the overall availability of these courses and the government's commitment to upskill and provide opportunities to actually learn new skills is a form of intrinsic motivating factor, intrinsic motive, a way to sort of evoke intrinsic motivation for learning in individuals, which is great. It's a really good initiative. I do. Okay, so we did this research actually on what you are talking about almost exactly. So at NTU, we interviewed a number of people in undergraduate and postgraduate students about their experience of Skills Future Credit and what they, whether they perceive this as an effective policy in helping them upskill. And while it's overall, it's perceived as an effective policy that is really good for providing people with skills. One of the interesting findings was that the overall sort of pragmatic approach to learning in general that is, you can see in universities that people tend to learn what they perceive as useful for their future career or for their studies. It does prevent them from learning for the sake of learning. So learning for the sake of learning is less prevalent. So usually people go and study for Skills Future Credit courses because they think this will help them get a better job or be more competitive in general. Learning for the sake of learning is much less common. And people do say this because I feel pressured to learn something I can use. I feel really bad learning something I might enjoy because I'm wasting my time. So maybe there's like a need for a shift towards, let's try and learn for the sake of learning because it's an enjoyable process and it does enrich your overall life experience, right? So I think this is definitely something that could be further expanded or like looked into, incorporated into the overall strategy. But as an initiative, of course, Skills Future is probably one of the unprecedented moves, by the government to actually emphasize the need to be future ready and learn as much as you can. Right. So when it comes to the questions from Jamie, so the Eastern mindsets. Okay. I'm not sure I necessarily agree whether it's more prevalent in the West, the shift towards open loop careers, because we did analyze employment data of SU2D students from the past several years, and a lot of them actually changed quite a few jobs, something like 2 jobs in 1 year or 3-4 jobs in 4 or 5 years. And we kind of see that careers, especially in the younger generation, are becoming more and more fragmented and not linear at all, not hierarchical. So I would say that it's definitely becoming more and more prevalent even in this part of the world. I mean, I can speak for Singapore. Given the sort of Eastern mindset, I would say that maybe the iron rice bowl is much less relevant in the context of Singapore, where there is a very competitive private sector that offers quite a few attractive jobs. So the government is not the biggest sort of employer. It is a bigger employer and it's very attractive, but obviously young people also tend to be interested in the private sector jobs because of other opportunities it gives them in terms of learning. So I would say that I would probably find a group of people or a certain demographic that prefers the job security of public service. And that would mean that the open loop careers solutions will need to be localized. But I do think that the overall sort of generational shift of millennials and Zoomers preferring more open loop careers in general will also mean that some of the findings could be generalizable for the West and for the East both. But we are only about to find out because the project has just started. So hopefully the data will show some interesting findings. I'm not sure I understand what presumption of care means in the interviews.
Yeah, so Alexander,
Hi.
if you, yeah, go
Yes,
ahead.
I'm here.
Yeah.
Hello.
I
Hi. Okay, so I noticed that there's generally a push towards having more interviews as a way of trying to keep an eye on your employees. But at the same time, I think interviews are a mechanism of showing care as well, that that whatever they're experiencing is valued and real and substantial. Do you think that there is, how to put this, by mandating that interviews be done, is there this issue where it becomes a more mechanical process, which reduces or dilutes the value of these interviews?
Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you for explaining. I think if you mandate anything, it might actually make it more mechanical. I do agree, which is why I think what's more important is having informal chats and just connecting with your employees on a human level, just showing genuine care in them as a person rather than seeing them as a cog in the machine. And I do understand that especially in large organizations that might not be possible. So that's why those regular interviews are set up as a means to sort of, have this in place so that it's actually done. But in general, I do think that what works better is when it's an informal chat to try and understand what actually bothers your employees, if anything. So yeah, I definitely think that maybe making it into a procedure may make it slightly more sort of pro forma rather than genuine. So yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure what you mean, Alexander, by red tape as a source of work and perceived action.
Okay, I'm very sorry.
No worries.
Okay, so all right, when you're in the public service, you tend to do a lot of administration, especially if you are much closer to like the really just like doing up forms and reports and whatnot. Wouldn't there be this sort of self-contradiction where you have to do all this administrative work, which is a form of red tape? This is a source of burnout, which pushes you towards burnout. But at the same time, you have to do it to feel like you're actually doing something. So is there some kind of way where we can balance this to minimize the sense of burnout or the effect on motivation, while at the same time makes them feel like, oh yeah, I'm actually still contributing. I'm still making, the wheels turn. I'm still spinning my plates.
Right. Okay. Thank you. It's much clearer now. So the thing is, the definition of red tape is that it will never make you feel like you're doing something. Red tape is only the things that are completely unnecessary, which is why cutting the red tape is, such a holy grail in just generally public sectors all over the world. So red tape is those bureaucratic procedures and policies that are in place that do not really achieve anything, but they're still there, rules that because they for the sort of seeming order, they are there in place. So there's actually this concept of green tape as well in public administration research. It's those rules that actually make your work more effective. So red tape is never the source of perceived action. When you're doing it, you're wasting your time and you know it, right? So I think in the research that we've done, what we tried to show is that if you are low on motivation and you also experience red tape, your work engagement is just going to plummet. So, but maybe we haven't tested the opposite. We don't know whether having motivation will, cushion you against the effects of red tape. We haven't tested that, but probably maybe it's a good hypothesis to test. So I think my answer to you would be cut red tape, even though it's probably next to impossible, because it's really difficult to have procedures in place and not have red tape. Maybe automation and digitalization is something that would help with that. But there's red tape in a lot of governments, in most governments around the world. So yeah, red tape needs to be cut. Yeah. So I hope that's helpful. I don't know if we have any more questions or if we're out of time.
It looks like that's all we have, which is great, because we are just about an hour after we formally started earlier. So maybe if there are no questions, if you have in 3 counts, just shout out, going once, going twice, gone. If not, we thank everyone for joining us. I think it was an engaging session with very good questions, and everybody was quite interested. And you know where Estelle is, so if you want to keep talking to her, you know where to find her. And we continue to welcome you to our future brown bags and to continue these conversations in various forms in the coming year. Right. With that, Estelle, any last words you want to share with us? Parting words before we end the session?
Just stay engaged and motivated. And it's really difficult in the pandemic, I know, but I hope everybody's keeping healthy. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care. Have a good rest of the week and the rest of the day. We'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.